Mau Mau, the rebellion against British rule in Kenya, awakened the deepest European fears of primitive African savagery. The British saw in it the work of the devil himself. In 1952, when Sir Evelyn Baring arrived as governor, he faced a rising that was to shake colonial rule throughout Africa. To the white settlers, this was home. They had created Kenya. And whatever Britain might want, they were determined to stay on top.
In 1922, Churchill gave the settlers a promise. He said, "This land is yours, the settlers, in perpetuity, not only for you, for your children and your grandchildren."
30,000 white settlers dominated 5 million Africans. In Kenya's most fertile area, the White Highlands, Africans could not own land, only labor on the white man's farms.
Let's be blunt. The Europeans number 1, Asians number 2 1/4, Africans number 4 1/2. They had no status at all. They were laborers, they were servants, they were what have you.
Originally, Britain wanted Kenya only as a link to areas deeper inside Africa. The Kikuyu, the largest tribe in Kenya, had been reduced to a narrow tribal reserve. Hemming in their growing population were the White Highlands. The capital, Nairobi, became a magnet for the Kikuyu, the most energetic and commercial of Kenya's tribes. While the British advertised farmland for white settlement, Kikuyu land hunger in their overcrowded reserve became intense. Among the tribes, they led the agitation for political change. They sent a young Kikuyu, Jomo Kenyatta, to England to put their case. He pressed for the return of their land and a share in government. When he came home in 1946, he was greeted as a national hero. Many Africans had fought in the war, seen white men killed. Kenyatta led them in a new militancy.
He seemed to have a synthesis of modernism and atavism. He seemed to be totally attuned to the background of his people, to their practices, their customs, their superstitions. He knew about Russia and Britain. He was a very broadly informed, human sort of man. I never felt other than dominated by his vibrant personality, a sort of hypnotic masculinity, and one felt enveloped by his warmth and at the same time slightly repelled by his menace.
He had magnetism. Absolute magnetism, and he could put anybody to ash by looking at him. And Hitler had the same thing, apparently, as far as his eyes. That man, he had something.
It's the only time in the whole of my life that I actually felt the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. In a way, he appeared to be rather like a very flamboyant black bookmaker, enormous great rings on his fingers, a very ornate stick, and very impressive eyes, rather sort of bored into. Coupled with the fact that you knew he was determined to ruin everything in your district if he could, had a terrible effect on one.
The British blamed Kenyatta for Kikuyu resistance to land improvement. Some Kikuyu felt that only violence would drive the whites out. They slashed the legs of white-owned cattle, tore out their intestines, and left them in agony under the African sun. The Kikuyu had always used magic and blood sacrifice. To break their ritual oaths was thought fatal. In 1950, the radical Kikuyus secretly founded Mau Mau and invented a new oath to unite the people in revolt against British rule. Young militants used Kenyatta's party, the Kenya African Union, KAU, as a cover.
We had oathing places in Nairobi and other areas. This was being organized under the umbrella of the Kenya African Union, and nobody would suspect, because sometimes we used to have our meetings in my office in Kiburi House. After having KAU meeting in the evening, then later at night, we bring our central committee of Mau Mau when everybody else who is not a member has left.
We knew our people were ignorant and they were ruled by the tradition customs, and where they thought that they held that oath could kill. And we tried to exploit the ignorance of our people.
Mau Mau killed many pro-British Kikuyu and those who refused to take the oath.
There were also the other forms of intimidation, disemboweling cats and pinning them to boards outside somebody's house with a notice underneath making various statements to the effect that if there was any further trouble from him, he would be murdered. That sort of thing. Various forms of intimidation, but it had a universal effect.
The slaughter grew, both in numbers and ferocity. The British were convinced they knew who was behind Mau Mau and its killings.
It's very difficult not to conclude that Kenyatta himself was the originator of it.
I was completely convinced that he was the actual leader of the Mau Mau, that he'd started the whole thing, that he was responsible for inventing the oaths that they had to take. I have no doubt that he instituted Mau Mau and kept it going.
I'm quite sure, yes, that he was responsible to start with. I knew perfectly well that headmen were being murdered and their huts set on fire with them locked inside and so on.
Most Kikuyu were just as certain. Kenyatta, their leader, ran Mau Mau. But the men who did disagree.
How much did Kenyatta know about the organization of Mau Mau?
I think he knew nothing.
At all?
At all. Kenyatta was among the older generation, so we feared that if he knew much, he may disagree with what we were thinking of doing. So it was only the younger generation which had decided that because all other means have failed, we must use violence.
He was not active in that organization, and we did not want him to be active in that one. And he did not know who were leading.
Kenyatta did not know who the leaders were?
No, and he could not say who was steering the wheel.
Kenyatta had avoided taking sides. In 1952, the British persuaded him to do so. At a mass rally alongside the pro-British chief Waruhiu, he cursed Mau Mau.
I think he was cornered. They forced him to denounce Mau Mau, and I think he did not know what to do about it. So he used a Kikuyu proverb, which said that Mau Mau should go under the roots of the tree, Miriam Kongoe, and which actually means go into the drains and never to come back. So it was taken very seriously by people.
Kenyatta's curse led the Mau Mau Central Committee to summon him.
When he came, we told him how we are disappointed. In fact, that was the time when the Central Committee introduced itself to him, that we are the Mau Mau Central Committee, we are organizing this and that, and we feel very hurt by your denunciation.
Kenyatta was left in no doubt that if he continued to denounce Mau Mau, they would deal with him.
Kenyatta would have been a very big trouble.
Was there
Even to the extent of being killed. It was not a joke by that time. There were no going back.
There was the possibility Kenyatta could have been killed?
Yes.
If he had tried to go back?
Yes.
And denounce Mau Mau? What makes you so sure of that?
Well, I know because I was the chief organizer and I know what was... people were serious about it. Within the movement, they had their local people. If they decide somebody will die, then, and death sentence has been passed by the bench, well, nobody can stop them.
So there were the local district liquidation squads, were there?
Everywhere. They were everywhere. Because, see, there were a lot of traitors, and they had to be stopped.
In October 1952, Chief Waruhiu, who had stood beside Kenyatta when he cursed Mau Mau, was murdered by them. Bering had been governor for only a week. Across the grave, he saw Jomo Kenyatta. They did not meet. The whites forced the new governor's hand. Bering declared a state of emergency. Kenyatta was arrested.
Troops are in the streets of Nairobi. Sir Evelyn Baring, the governor, salutes the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers who have flown in to help clear his colony of the Mau Mau menace, which has struck fear into Kenya's very heart. More than 3,500 have been arrested already. All have to be carefully checked by police security men, for in such a decisive swoop as this, it is all too easy for the innocent to suffer. The objective of this secret society is to drive all white men out of Kenya. All who carry the mark of the Mau Mau must be hunted out so that peace may come to this troubled colony.
Mau Mau reaction was bloody.
From the Cathedral of the Highlands in Nairobi are borne the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Roger Ruck and their 6-year-old son, Michael, a British family brutally murdered by the Mau Mau.
The Rucks were friends of ours. The labourer on the farm drove the horses away from the house. And then they went out looking for the horses, and they came back to Roger in the evening, that's when they committed their atrocities, and said, "We found your horse, and we've now got the chap who pinched them. He's sitting in the back of your lorry." So Roger came round, took a look into the lorry, and they just started chopping him up from the back. Esme came out when she heard them shouting, and they just walked straight up to her and chopped her up with these pangas, as we call them. And the little boy started crying, and they went upstairs and they chopped up this little boy.
Incensed by the murder of the Ruck family, 2,000 Europeans assemble outside Government House in Nairobi. Refused audience with the governor, Sir Evelyn Baring. The demonstrators attempt to storm Government House.
White settlers had always accused the administration of being pro-African. Now, they felt Baring was hiding behind a cordon of black police. By chance, inside Government House was a settler politician.
Well, I went along to Baring, and he said, "You must go out and control the crowd." I will not go out. One day another crowd may demand my going out. When I arrived, the settlers were standing their cigarettes on the arms and faces of the police, the black policemen, to get them clear of the doors so they could smash the doors in. Well, I ordered the police away. And the policeman stood at attention and said, "I only take my orders, sir, from the commissioner." And I remember turning round, because you must remember it's terribly intense. I said, "Where the bloody hell is the commissioner?" He was just behind me. And I said, "You take your men away. You take your men away. I'll be responsible." Just as we were getting the crowd settled down, the Sultana of Zanzibar, who was naturally a dark-featured woman, came out onto the veranda to look over the crowd. And, of course, they went mad. I remember one South African woman saying, there, look, they've got the bloody niggers already in the place. The bloody niggers are already in the place.
Now that the killing had been turned on them, the whites armed themselves. All Africans were suspect.
The fact that your own cook, who'd been with you for 30, 40 years, could be oathed in a way that he could come and kill you. Unbelievable. You'd been a friend to him, you'd been helpful to his children, you'd done this, that, and the other over the years, and yet, happily one night, he would come and slit your throat. This they couldn't understand. They couldn't understand the depth of bitterness.
All told, 32 settlers were killed by Mau Mau during the emergency. The manner of their deaths created an atmosphere of fear and vengeance. Against this background, Kenyatta and 5 others were charged with managing Mau Mau.
Why have a trial? We didn't want a trial. We thought it was a waste of time and only big publicity to Mau Mau, which a detention order would never have had. As it was, that trial went on for months and months and months. And so the people suddenly said, well, this chap must be a good chap. Now he's okay. He's been tried by the white people. They all thought that it's a rigged trial. And by God, it was.
Pressure from the House of Commons forced the British to hold a trial. The police searched Kenyatta's papers for evidence, but they found no link with Mau Mau. The administration needed a conviction. After careful consideration, they selected Judge Ransley Thacker to hear the case.
Thacker was brought back from retirement on a very high fee to do the dirty work for the government. In fact, before that, one registrar and a senior judge told me that they had in fact been offered or asked to take this case on condition that they would promise that Kenyatta would be convicted, and they had refused to do so. Thacker confided in his clerk to say that it doesn't matter what the defense people say, they can do what they want, but I will make a cast iron judgment. I will make sure that my judgment is so well couched and so well written that even a court of appeal will not change it. I am going to make sure that they convicted and given the maximum sentence. He decided this right from the start. There's no doubt about it.
The battles between the judge and Kenyatta's lawyers attracted world attention. What was not known was the arrangement between Judge Thacker and the government.
Thacker, simultaneously while conducting the trial, was carrying on a correspondence with the government about special payments to be made to him, as he thought it might be dangerous to live in Kenya after bringing in a conviction. And therefore he might have to leave the country and retire somewhere else. And finally was paid a sum of £20,000.
All sorts of obstacles were put in our way. Defense witnesses were threatened. In fact, in one particular case, when we brought about 10 or 12 persons to prove an alibi of Kenyatta or prove that in fact he did not do what he was supposed to do, including some ministers from the church and the chief and others, they were all arrested as soon as they gave evidence.
One key prosecution witness, Rawson Macharia, gave crucial evidence that helped convict Kenyatta. 5 years later, he swore to a court that he had been bribed to tell lies.
He had written letters from the government, which he showed me, that he would be sent to England, he would be educated there, his family would be supported, and when he came back, he'd be given a job. At that stage, I decided to take an affidavit from him, in which he said that the whole of his evidence was invented, that the other 10 witnesses whose names he had given were telling the truth, and he'd been committing perjury.
Macharia's changed evidence was not believed by the courts. Whatever the truth, he had helped secure heavy sentences.
The real violence of Mau Mau took place after Kenyatta was arrested. And I believe by arresting the hierarchy of Mau Mau, you put inside those people who were, perhaps, their aims were peaceful means, or moderately peaceful, then all the thugs took over. And the killings, the real killings of Mau Mau, took place after Kenyatta had been arrested.
Kenyatta's conviction persuaded hundreds of young Kikuyu of the need for violent struggle. With few arms and no allies, they operated as small gangs in the forests.
Mutito ihinda rĩa mbere rĩa gũthiĩ kwarĩ na heho ona ng'aragu nĩ kwarĩ tondũ gũtiakĩrĩ irio no gĩthaka na twacokire tũkĩmenyera heho na irio ningĩ nĩ twagĩcionaga na thĩna na tũkomĩrĩria nĩ ũndũ wa kwenda gwĩtia wĩyathi tũkona gũtirĩ ũndũ ũngĩ ũngĩtũma tiga no tũrũire mbara yo nyene.
Kikuyu, who had prospered under British rule, sent their men to join the Home Guard, armed and trained by the government. The Mau Mau rebellion had become a civil war. In March 1953, at Lari, a local quarrel over land turned into a massacre. 94 Kikuyu were killed. Mau Mau was blamed. To survive, the Kikuyu swore loyalty to the British by day and the Mau Mau by night. The civil war, African against African, was to last for 5 years. The pictures from Lari shocked the world.
When I got there was the most dreadful scene I've ever seen in my life. There were huts in flames. A man called ex-Chief Luka and his family were burnt to death. Small children had been crucified. Bodies of other families had been mutilated. It was the most horrible scene.
Those who had survived the slaughter had been brought here, most of them to have their wounds treated. Many have since died. It wasn't a pleasant sight. Men and women with their bodies scarred forever by clubs and knives and fire. The stories the wounded told were terrible to hear, of the whole village set ablaze, and of the savage butchery that followed. Yet the survivors, I suppose, must be counted as the lucky ones. Upon the children, too, the Mau Mau had laid its evil mark. The lucky ones, I wonder.
During 1953, the year after the emergency was declared, the British were desperate to uncover the Mau Mau gangs.
We had to get information. We couldn't get information at all. At that stage, the Kikuyu were probably 90% on the side of the Mau Mau, and we felt in order to track down the terrorists, we did resort to third degree. When, on the rare occasions, we caught a terrorist and tried to interrogate him, to start with, there was no way you could get them to talk. And we and certainly the police and many of the police reserve tried methods that we would never normally accept. Electric shocks, that sort of thing. It was a waste of time. It didn't work at all.
Kikuyu villages suspected of Mau Mau sympathies were raided.
Sasa ndio tulikaa kidogo tukaona askari ya Kamatimu nachanganyika na ame na kuja saa 12 mapema mnasikia milango fugueni kuingia ndani ni kupiga nyinyi tu, hakuna kitu kingine. Sasa mkapigwa, mwingine anapigwa tena anapelekwa paka huko post akiwa mahututi. Kufika huko wanakwenda wanampiga, nasikia paka nakufa kabisa.
The army commander, General Erskine, tried to stop the excesses. He made his first priority the cleaning up of Nairobi, the nerve center of Mau Mau. In April 1954, all Kikuyu in the city were rounded up in a month-long operation.
At one stage, at the early stages, 1 in every 3 adult males of the entire Kikuyu tribe was in detention.
All over Kenya, screening camps had been set up to process the total of 80,000 who were arrested. Before they could even be considered for release, the authorities tried to identify those who had taken the oath.
We were trying to deal with it, so to speak, in its own coin. They felt that the oath had bound them and that if they broke the oath, something terrible would happen to them. We were concerned to try to break the power of the oath, to, so to speak, cleanse them, so that its power was no longer binding.
The government even employed witch doctors to decontaminate those who had joined Mau Mau.
The vital thing, as far as the administration was concerned, was to get someone to declare that he'd taken an oath. It was thought, in some mysterious way, that as soon as you signed a paper, however you signed it, after half an hour's roughing up, after 4 hours roughing up, after 3 weeks roughing up, as soon as you signed that, you were in some way getting rid of this awful atavistic horror that had taken hold of you when you first took it.
At the same time, the government lured hundreds of fighters out of the forest by generous surrender terms. Forest leaders resorted to ever more extreme oaths to hold their men together.
Uhoro wa mutitule nitwali hede kunywa mumare no ginya wambe hare buri yathijagwo yathijwo ukamba ukanywa ukaria nyameyo nyamere ngiri ugacoka ugekira hagithita-ini ukaharukia uguo waharukia uguo gihiri ngi ukaharukia haha hana hari nyama ya mundu ugathie ho ukanywa thakame were hiu mundu ari murage nigu kamuruga maita 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 riu nitakuga ati ona mundu ukamuona hana thigiriri ati nduri hindi utangimuraga.
These oaths were read to newly arrived British troops. The aim was to stiffen their hatred of the gangs. The effect was to terrify young national servicemen into killing anything that moved in the forest.
These Mau Mau were like animals. They lived in the bush, they had long hair, some of them had game skins, coats around them. They ran on, carried a gun in one hand, and they ran like baboons through the bush. Now, in the forest, they were lying down watching you, and these poor lads would be coming along, walking upright, had no experience of bush warfare, it wasn't their fault, but actually fighting against people like that, they were useless. You had to hunt like you hunt a leopard or a lion, and you had to beat these Mau Mau at their own game. There was this chap, he'd seen me, and he was trying to get himself hidden in some stones. So I put a bullet straight behind his head. He came over backwards. His adjutant, the most awful fellow I've ever seen. Tall fellow with one eye, long hair, had skins all over him, got up and he took a horrible look at me and took off, and I thought I could shoot him like this, and I shot and missed him. Then I put the gun up and got him too. Then there was another one running a short way over, and I put a bullet, turned out to be a young girl of 16. The ones they used to send in to get their food.
Twaharukagia ndigizo twathie rũĩ irio icio kũrĩ harĩa hatuĩkĩte irĩ igũ akorwo rĩu nĩ ta haha macani-inĩ maya ikaigwo ho makaya kuoya arĩa ti waga kũmaha irio tondũ nao nĩ megũkũraga waga kũmaha irio na nĩ magũkũhũra na nĩ ũgũitwo ucoke ũreke ũiguĩte ruo mũno na mũkanda na warĩa maigua nĩ ũkũheanaga irio nĩ woywo ũhũrwo na ũthamio.
Those Kikuyu still held in detention were forced to work. From a Guthi camp came repeated allegations of brutality.
I would say that that camp was conducted with restrained harshness and severity, that it was extremely orderly and clean, but that probably a degree of physical violence was used to secure the obedience of those who might be thought to be a danger to the general stability of the camp.
Ugathiururukio kihuragwo nginya kiara gikenja irima riria ringi ni gukua ndoo iri na miigua kaigerera na iri na mai ugatengerio kihuragwo nginyagia mai magwitikagire guku
ukakorwo ugithunguka kagoto kari loud tamaita 20 tari uraiga karai kauthi kari kiongo unyitite utengeretio ni thigari nacio ile laini o kihuragwo yani kuiga thigari uthire hari muthigari o kiguthagwo ugithiagira hari muthigari o kiguthagwo.
I got a letter which I couldn't ignore, which said, death of detainees in a Guthi camp. And then another letter came from them saying, please act else we shall all be dead. And therefore one had to, I always sent it to the Secretary of State, of course, for verification. But what was so infuriating was that he always had an administrative inquiry, which meant that the very people who were in charge of the security forces who were committing these atrocities were the ones who sat in judgment on the case. And the whole instinct of the Europeans and those in charge was to cover up, always cover up.
The colonial secretary, Alan Lennox Boyd, continued to stand by the Kenya government.
We were certainly pretty nervous. As civil servants to the Secretary of State, we were very anxious that nothing disastrous should happen. But I don't recall any occasion on which any, as it were, explicit request was sent out to the governor by the Secretary of State, keep the violence down. Probably there was more done that didn't come to light than actually did come to light. But Lex Boyd was conscious that there was this hidden bit of the iceberg of violence, I don't know.
But being an astute politician, he couldn't have been totally blind.
No. I think we all realise there must be a lot more. If there were one or two things going on, there probably was a lot more.
It was intrinsic in the whole attitude of the government of Kenya, as blandly endorsed by the Secretary of State, that an African life wasn't as important as a European life. That was the whole, almost subconscious approach of those in charge.
The entire Kikuyu population was uprooted and herded into protected villages with home guards and watchtowers. This isolated the rural people from the gangs.
They had to build their own villages. It was done by compulsory labor, and we surrounded the villages in areas I was with ditches with spiked bamboos in the bottom. So it really was extremely difficult for anyone or any animal even to get through them.
Villagization removed the Kikuyu people from their farms into glorified concentration camps, where they were given 23-hour curfews, and as a battle measure, it was very effective. It stopped food supplies to the forest.
Tugagithii tugakimatha tugacoka riu tugacoka ugicagi tugacokio ugicagi riu ni twakihingirwo hindi iyo nario twari na ruo runene muno na ng'aragu nene tondu natuo tuirio turia turi mugunda mau ni kimathire.
The measures worked. The tide was turning against the gangs. Growing numbers of Kikuyu came over to the government. Bering hoped that land reform and money for farmers would win over the remainder. While the chiefs accepted medals, the masses still looked to Kenyatta as their leader.
We were telling them that Kenyatta would never, ever return to the Kikuyu country. Never, ever. And we were making this promise to the loyalists, we were making it to the general public. This was, of course, supplemented by the fact that Kenyatta's name, his house was totally removed, his name was removed from everything. He was now to be a non-person.
We do understand and realize the fears of the European minorities in Kenya. They regard or link Jomo Kenyatta with Mau Mau or terrorism. But we, the African people, know that he is a sincere leader of his people who had devoted all his time to the benefit of the ordinary man.
In October 1956, the most wanted Mau Mau fighter of all, Dedan Kimathi, was captured, then tried and executed. The war against the gangs was all but over. Officially, more than 11,000 Mau Mau had been killed. Those left in the forest posed no real threat. To avoid more African unrest, the colonial secretary, Alan Lennox Boyd, persuaded the settlers to accept an increase in the African share in government. The British were now keen to release the remaining detainees. But these were mostly young and violent. They had resisted all attempts to make them confess the oath. In the camps, they were out of control.
There was not even the possibility of knowing who most of them were, because they made themselves bracelets, which they skillfully hammered like modern watch straps, out of the corrugated aluminium huts, and they were identified by their own identification and not by district or by name or by tribe or anything else. They had their own identity and their own command.
The British attempted to regain control by dividing the prisoners into small groups.
They hurled themselves into a vast, tangled human mass. And we then physically moved in and manhandled them without what you might call punitive force or intimidatory force, what later came to be known as compelling force. They were taken by the hand, leg, wrist, whatever, and dragged out and frog-marched with whatever force was necessary, which was considerable. To handle a tough young man physically is very difficult.
Then at Hola Camp in 1959, the use of compelling force went too far. 11 prisoners, refusing to work, were beaten to death by African warders. The outcry shook the House of Commons.
There we had the evidence, and I was able, through those documents, to prove to the House of Commons that these men had, in fact, been clubbed to death by illegal behaviour in the running of the camp.
The government of Harold Macmillan was shaken when one of their own leading backbenchers, a former minister, savaged them.
They had been warned that the policy which was being adopted could have this kind of result. Accordingly, the people who had adopted that policy must be held responsible for it. That was my argument, and that is my belief still. And that would mean that the governor himself would have to accept responsibility unless it could clearly be vested in someone else who had acted without his knowledge or authority.
The people who were involved in Hola were the same people who'd been involved in what is really a remarkable feat in getting over 70,000 Mau Mau detainees out of the camps, back into ordinary life. We all realize that we made mistakes from top to the bottom, all of us. We are trying to put them right, the mistakes we made. And we've had a committee who, from the Vatican, been looking into what we should do in the future.
No senior official was dismissed over Hola. Some months later, Bering himself retired as planned. After Hola, the British released the remaining detainees. They simply went home. The cabinet decided Britain could no longer sustain white settler power in Kenya. Instead, the new colonial secretary, Ian MacLeod, announced Britain must come to terms with the growing force of African nationalism.
MacLeod was not a man who minced words. He told everybody that the European position was really going to be dismantled. The sense of shock on the part of the local Europeans was immense, and I think the sense of shock to the colonial administration was equally great. We were really quite taken aback by the swiftness of determined change.
Was MacLeod ready to listen to reasoned opposition to the speed at which he wanted to go?
No. He hardly listened to anybody.
That chap can't look you in the eyes. He gave you a limp handshake, said he had no preconceived ideas. That meant he had every preconceived idea. And apparently he was a brilliant bridge player, and chicanery was his art of bridge playing. And as far as his politics is concerned, I think he stank. Why couldn't he tell us the truth?
MacLeod played his cards carefully. In January 1960, he called all Kenya's leading politicians to a meeting in London.
MacLeod and I were discussing the general position of decolonization, really, you know, and how the timing should go, when all of a sudden a man brought in a message, in other words, a telegram. And MacLeod opened this telegram and read it and gave a great start. And he turned and said, "My God, Michael, look at that, look at that. We're going to be the last in Africa instead of the first." And I read the telegram, and it was a message from our representative in Brussels to say that the Belgians had decided immediately to give the Congo independence. Now, that was a tremendous shock to me, because I suddenly realized that MacLeod wasn't at all interested in my fate or Kenya's fate. He was only really interested in whether the British are going to be the first or last in discarding the robes of colonialism.
MacLeod decided to give power to the Africans faster than any of them expected.
I believe that one day Kenya will be governed by a democratic government, representative and elected by the people. And by the people, I include anybody who decides to make Kenya his home.
In how many years?
And who accepts to be treated as an equal citizen with everybody else.
After 4 weeks of argument, MacLeod decided it was time to call a halt.
He allowed everybody to talk and talk and talk themselves out. I saw very interesting discussion, because when he knew that we had all talked ourselves off, then he actually came with his proposal.
MacLeod announced, to general surprise, an immediate African majority in the Kenyan parliament. But before independence could be granted, two dangers remained. Kenyatta, the British believed, could bring chaos to Kenya. But popular African support for him was so strong that most African politicians now felt obliged to demand his release.
Will you press for the release of Jomo Kenyatta?
Certainly, yes.
How?
Again, by intensifying our efforts and more pressure on the British government and also the Kenya government, and using whatever influences we've gained from this present constitution for further efforts to secure his release.
The other danger was the die-hard whites. They had always relied on support within the Tory party. They felt betrayed by the Prime Minister. Macmillan feared their hostility would topple him.
We were naturally very upset. I mean, when you lived in a country like Kenya, you fought for it, and your roots were deep in the soil of Kenya, because it was our heritage. We'd been promised it was our land in perpetuity. If it was handed over to the blacks, one would have to leave, and your children would lose their heritage.
Europeans, unable to accept the idea of black government, were already packing up to leave. To diffuse white anxiety, the new governor risked a black explosion.
I repeat and confirm that in my view, Jomo Kenyatta's release would be at present a danger to security. The decision is mine. By this statement, I wish to make it clear that accordingly he will remain under restriction.
They wanted people, all the propaganda which they sent round, wanted the people to believe that Kenyatta is an evil leader who had put the country into trouble, and he should never be allowed to come back to life again.
The governor's broadcast increased African pressure for Kenyatta's release. When the Kenya African National Union, KANU, won the election, its leaders refused office until Kenyatta was freed. The deadlock now threatened the peaceful transfer of power that Britain wanted. So, in August 1961, Governor Renison bowed to the inevitable. Jomo Kenyatta, the man he had called the leader to darkness and death, returned home to a tumultuous welcome. After his release, Kenyatta accepted the presidency of KANU, a party whose radical platform had included the seizure of European-owned land. The whites were horrified. KANU was a near certainty to take over when Britain left.
KANU did give the impression of being excessively extreme. Land confiscation, nationalization of all industry, closing down of foreign investment, excessive Africanization. So naturally British interests were disturbed because they thought they would have an extreme, perhaps almost communist regime.
Kenyatta surprised everyone, white and black. To secure independence, he knew that Kenya needed stability, not a new upheaval. He overruled the radicals.
We don't want to rob anybody of his property. We're not concerned of robbing people of their property, no. But what we want to get is power, that is the government. We want to rule our country.
Our main cause for struggle was to gain our land back. And independence or self-government was only being used as a means of taking back our land. And without land, then everybody thought that we had been sold out.
Kenyatta was afraid that many of his supporters would grab white-owned land. He needed to buy it for them. He turned to Britain for the money and distributed some land in the White Highlands to African farmers. Kenyatta, with British aid, fought off Kikuyu unrest. He had no place for Mau Mau. He ordered the few fighters left in the forest to come out. Kenyatta gave them nothing, but greeted them as heroes.
He's going to be an ordinary citizen because all he wanted to see is an African flag flying over Kenya. That's all he was important.
What are his followers going to do with their arms?
Their follower and their arm they will bring their arms to me, to their government.
The settlers were still wary. They invited him to a meeting in the Highlands.
With a goodwill, all of us, and this is the government policy. We believe that the Kenya is large enough. Kenya potentiality is great. And all of us, and I'm not telling you this because I'm in your meeting, I'm telling you what I believe and what my government believes. That white, brown, black can work together harmoniously in this country and make this country great.
And Kenyatta said, if I made mistakes, forgive me. If you made mistakes, I forgive you. We must not forget the past, but we must forgive and work together. To think, Herr God, we have a statesman who does not want to take our land away, who does not want to kick us all out, who wants to keep the European farming here, who wants to keep the European community, and it did more to reassure the expatriate community than any other speech made by any other leader in this country.
By Independence Day, The devil, whom the British had consigned to oblivion, had become the hero of white and black alike.
Next week in End of Empire, the empire in Africa declines and its eventual collapse brings down Britain's Prime Minister. And don't forget to join us Tuesday night at 8 for the final program of Focal Point, which looks at the changing character of Sydney's historic Rocks area.